So let's talk about the Cuban economy, which is currently a disaster. It is in a recession for the first time since the 1990s, and the reason for that is that most of its historical sources of foreign currency are down, with the exception of tourism, which I'll get back to later. So, for instance, just last year, Venezuela imported about 100,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba at a subsidized rate. And Cuba would turn around and sell much of this oil on the global market for a profit. However, since the Venezuelan economy has imploded, those 100,000 barrels per day have decreased to 55,000. As a result, you see widespread gas shortages across the island. You have seen rolling blackouts in Havana last year, and the government has actually sent home government workers from their offices in the middle of the day in order to try to save electricity. Now, the global commodities market in general is down, which means that nickel and cobalt are down, which are Cuba's most important mineral exports. The agricultural sector, meanwhile, is in shambles. Before the revolution, Cuba used to be the world's largest exporter of coffee and sugar. Now, it doesn't even break into the single digits in either one of those. 14% of Cuba's arable land is desertified, and 80% of the country has experienced an historic 100-year drought, including the easternmost provinces, which are the most agriculturally productive. Much of this has to do with very poor land management. There's this joke. So there's a little Cuban egg, and he's running down the streets of Havana. He's got little arms, little legs, and he's booking it. And right behind him is a giant crowd of Cubans trying to grab him and eat him, chasing after him. So this little guy is running, and he turns a corner, and leaning up against the side of the wall is a big, juicy steak, smoking a cigarette, not a care in the world. And so the egg turns to steak and goes, "I said it. You need to get the hell out of here. There is a giant crowd of Cubans right behind me trying to grab me and eat me. I can't imagine what they're going to do to you." And the steak nonchalantly puffs on his cigarette and he goes, "Nah, I'm not worried about that. These people haven't seen a steak in so long, they wouldn't know what to do with me." The truth behind that is that Cuba's livestock, both dairy and meat, are severely depleted. The few cows that are left on the island are actually emaciated, and it is illegal to sell meat, to sell beef, on the open market. Though, of course, that doesn't stop people. Probably Cuba's most important export, just like any other commodity, I guess, is doctors. So what they do is that they send their doctors to countries like Brazil and Venezuela. And those countries then push those doctors out into the countryside where they provide medical services to the very poor. Now, those governments pay the Cuban government directly for the doctors. The Cuban government then turns around and pays a very small fraction of that to the doctors. Now, what's happened? Since the Brazilian and Venezuelan economies are in decline, they have imported significantly less doctors. Also, many of the doctors have defected because of very poor and dangerous working conditions as well as very low pay. Let's see, so in 2018, Raul Castro is set to step down as the president of Cuba, although he will remain as the head of the Cuban Communist Party. And he's basically said that he's done doing reforms. So the economic problems that Cuba is experiencing currently are going to be those of his successor. Now, who is this individual? The supposed successor is named Diaz-Canel, and what we know about him is not that much, really. He keeps a pretty low profile, and he doesn't speak in public very much. We do know, however, that he's about 57 years old, and he rose through the Cuban Communist Party apparatus, which means that he has no direct ties to the Cuban military. Also, he wasn't one of these barbudos, these bearded guys, out in La Sierra fighting Batista. And that gives him far less legitimacy than the Castro brothers. The real question is whether he will be the person setting policy in Havana, or if the actual power behind the throne is going to be another individual named General Gonzalez. Now, he's a general in the Cuban army, and he just so happens to be Raul Castro's son-in-law. He's also the head of GAISA, which is a Cuban state-owned enterprise that controls the most lucrative aspects of the Cuban economy, including Old Havana. Basically, tourism is the only aspect of Cuba's economy that's keeping the rest of it afloat. And tourism is intrinsically tied to the private sector. So in most countries, the top of the socioeconomic pyramid is occupied by professionals like yourselves, lawyers, doctors, engineers, accountants, while the bottom is occupied by those in the services industry. However, in Cuba, that pyramid is inverted. So the top is occupied by individuals like waiters, taxi drivers, bartenders, while those at the bottom are the professionals. The reason for this is that the services sector has direct access to foreign currency through tourism, while those at the bottom are not allowed to work in the private sector, and therefore make the average Cuban income monthly of $25. Those in the services industry can make that amount in a single night through tips alone. So currently there are about 535,000 individuals directly employed in the private sector in Cuba. However, this number has been increasing steadily over the last few years, and this is in a country of about 11 million people. If you take into account their families and those indirectly employed in the private sector, that number actually increases to about half the Cuban workforce. Many of these people work in privately owned restaurants known as paladares, or they rent out their rooms to tourists. These are known as casas particulares. There are also plenty of taxi drivers, waiters, and of course sex workers. The Cuban government does not recognize these businesses or these business people as legal entities. So that means that as a business person, I can't divvy up shares, I can't form a joint venture with the government or a foreign company, I can't export without using the state-owned export agency, and I can't accept foreign direct investment. Furthermore, the Cuban government only recognizes 201 specific categories that you can work in as someone in the private sector. These include people like hairdressers, nail stylists, shoe shiners, laundry washers, but like I said earlier, it does not include any of the professional services. What's more, if you work in one of these categories, you can't work in any of the other categories. So if I'm a shoe shiner, I can't also repair shoes. I can only shine them. And the Cuban government regularly cracks down on those who ignore these rules. The Cuban tax code, meanwhile, is purposefully structured in a way to mitigate wealth accumulation. So what does this look like in practice? Say I am the owner of a paladar, and I've got 20 tables in my restaurant, and business is going pretty well. I'm taxed at a rate of about 40%. But if I want to increase the number of tables at my restaurant to 25, that rate will increase to over 70%. Likewise, if I'm the owner of a casa particular, I can only rent out 3 rooms. In neither case can I open up additional establishments. So I can't open a new restaurant, I can't open a new B&B, nothing. The way people get around this is that they get their family members, their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, whatever, to open up new establishments under their names, while the controlling partner remains the former. Let's talk about the tech sector. So currently there are plenty of Cuban coders and website developers working for companies in the United States, in Latin America, and in Europe. However, there are a lot of obstacles in their way. So as a coder, what does it look like for me to go online? So first thing I need to do is grab my laptop and go to a public Wi-Fi hotspot, usually located outdoors in a public park. Mind you, this is in a country where it's constantly raining. The reason for this is that, with very few exceptions, Cubans are not allowed to have internet access in their homes or offices. So grab my laptop, go to the park, log on. In order to log on, I need to pay, on average, between $1.50 and $2 an hour. Remember, this is in a country where the average monthly wage is $25. Also, it has one of the slowest internet speeds in the world. So I log on, I download my instructions, and I log off as quickly as possible. Then I go back to my house and I work offline throughout the day. At the end of the day, I walk back to the park, log back on, and upload all of my work product. As you can tell, that is a highly inefficient way to operate. Yeah. So let's talk about U.S.-Cuba relations. The embargo, as it's currently structured, is comprised of several pieces of legislation anchored by the Helms-Burton Act. The Obama administration has done basically everything that it could do under its own authority to loosen it. That means that any additional changes that come have to go through Congress. Currently, Cuba has really stopped being a partisan issue in Congress. So basically because no one cares other than the Cuban Americans. So if you look at the different pieces of legislation making their ways through the two chambers, whether it be the Agricultural Credit Amendment, or the Travel Amendment, or the Trade Amendment, you'll note that they have plenty of Democratic and Republican co-sponsors. The only real consolidated opposition bloc against full normalization comes from the Cuban American representatives and senators of both parties. And they have formed this narrative, which is false, that President Trump won Florida and therefore the election because of his hardline stance on Cuba got him the Cuban American vote. The reason why this is false is because nationwide President Trump actually lost the Cuban American vote, first time in decades, and he actually lost Miami-Dade County by 10 percentage points. As a US citizen, your ability to trade with and travel to Cuba freely are severely curtailed. So the only things that you can export to Cuba are agricultural products, medical devices, infrastructure, materials, or equipment that will be used to directly benefit the Cuban people, and this includes the tech sector, and humanitarian materials used during natural disaster. And you can't import anything from Cuba that, from a state-owned enterprise that has direct ties to the Cuban military. The problem being the Cuban military controls much of the economy. Last year, for the first time since the 50s, the only imports from Cuba were a small batch of coffee imported by Nescafe. And the way they got around the military rule is because they purchased it from an agricultural cooperative. The second was a small batch of artisanal charcoal, also purchased from an agricultural cooperative. Now, in terms of travel as a U.S. citizen, you can only go to Cuba under 12 distinct visa categories. These include journalistic, scientific, religious, sports. They don't include tourist. So you cannot legally go to Cuba as a U.S. citizen just to hang on the beach and be a tourist.